Mine is the first visit of a Canadian Prime Minister to China in nearly a decade. The world has changed much since that last visit. And I believe the progress that we have made in the partnership sets us up well for the new world order.
In January 2026, a significant diplomatic standoff erupted between the United States and Canada that has captured global attention. Canadian Prime Minister Carney, in an effort to signal Canadian autonomy on the world stage, negotiated a trade arrangement with China in Beijing that reduced Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese electronic vehicles and agricultural goods. This divergence from U.S. trade policy, which has maintained high tariffs on Chinese goods, drew immediate and sharp retaliation from President Donald Trump, who threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian imports. If Ottawa pursued deeper economic ties with Beijing, Carney tried to clarify that Canada had no intention of a full free trade pact with China and was merely adjusting tariffs on select goods under market rules. But the dispute quickly became emblematic of broader questions about trade alliances, economic dependency, and global power balances. To understand President Trump's response to Canada's overture toward China, one must start with the basic reality. Canada's economy is deeply entwined with the United States, and any attempt by Ottawa to pivot toward Beijing inherently threatens U.S. economic interests. Trump's tariff threat is not merely rhetoric posturing. It reflects a strategic imperative to prevent Canada from becoming a backdoor through which Chinese goods, especially electric vehicles, might enter the North American market at reduced tariffs, with Canadian EV tariffs lowered from 100% to 6.1%, and quotas allowing tens of thousands of vehicles to enter annually. There is a tangible risk that cheap Chinese imports could undercut U.S. automakers and weaken the U.S. production base. So in a social media post, Trump warned that the Canadian leadership was mistaken if it thought Canada would become a drop-off port for Chinese products aiming to flood U.S. markets. And he reiterated that Canada lives because of its access to the American market. This blunt language may be politically aggressive, but it also underscores a basic truth of North American trade. Canada's market is small relative to the US, and Canada's auto and manufacturing sectors rely on US supply chains and consumer demand. Foreign policy and trade cannot be abstract exercises in diplomatic goodwill. They must reflect economic realities. So President Trump's stance thus functions as a protective tariff posture, preventing third-party dumping through a US neighbor that remains the largest destination for Canadian exports. Canadian goods, from canola and pork to steel and aluminum, are a crucial part of US supply chains. Blocking a potential entry point for cheap Chinese imports that undercut US producers is a rational exercise of executive authority. By contrast, Carney's diplomatic gambit with China reads as both symbolic virtue signaling and a miscalculation of geopolitical leverage.
It seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And this aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. Well, it won't. So what are our options? In 1978, the Czech dissident Václav Havel, later president, wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. And in it, he asked a simple question: how did the communist system sustain itself? And his answer began with the greengrocer. Every morning, this shopkeeper places a sign in his window: "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places the sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same, the system persists. Not through violence alone, but through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false. Havel called this living within a lie. The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. And its fragility comes from the same source. When even one person stops performing, when the greengrocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. Friends, it is time for companies and countries to take their signs down. For decades, countries like Canada prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. We joined its institutions, we praised its principles, we benefited from its predictability. And because of that, we could pursue values-based foreign policies under its protection. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful. And American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals. And we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition.
To just by its very nature, going to be defending Canada. Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way. They should be grateful also, but they're not. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. But they should be grateful to us. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements.
Carney's rhetoric at the World Economic Forum encouraging middle powers to push back against coercion and to band together to avoid being on the menu of great powers may have played well in Davos always, but in practical terms, it antagonized Canada's closest ally while aligning economically with China, a strategic rival to Western democracies and a known violator of market norms. More concretely, Canada's reduction of tariffs on Chinese EVs, even with quotas, was interpreted by US policymakers as significant divergence from established North American trade coordination. Even though he insists Canada will not pursue a full free trade agreement with China, the symbolic impact of slashing tariffs on Chinese manufactured goods sends exactly the wrong message. That Canada is willing to prioritize bilateral ties with China over alignment with the US and Mexico under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. The auto industry is particularly vulnerable in this dynamic. Canada's automotive sector is deeply integrated into the US market, and stabilizing that industry depends on preserving tariff barriers that protect North American manufacturers against subsidized foreign competition. Cheap Chinese EVs could erode market share for US and Canadian models, diminishing investment in North American manufacturing infrastructure and accelerating offshoring. Trump striking back with tariff threats was not only predictable, it was economically necessary. The narrative that Canada can somehow play both sides of the US-China economic bifurcation misunderstands fundamental trade realities. Canada exports over $600 billion annually to the United States, with daily cross-border goods and services trade in the billions. The US also sources a majority of its crude oil and electricity from Canada, and Canada is a leading supplier of key strategic minerals and metals. In this context, any hint of Canada drifting toward a trade partnership with China does not enhance Canadian autonomy. It merely exposes the country's economic vulnerability. Moreover, critics within Canada have noted that the auto industry, a sector that employs hundreds of thousands directly and indirectly, cannot thrive without access to the integrated North American market. A small domestic market cannot support large-scale EV manufacturing without US participation. Challenging the symmetry of the US-Canada trade relationship is, therefore, a practical misstep. Canada's legal obligations under the USMCA also constrain the scope of its potential China engagement. Under the terms of the agreement, Canada cannot pursue a free trade deal with a non-market economy like China without prior notification and negotiation with its partners. Carney himself reaffirmed that Canada respects its commitment under USMCA and has no intention of entering such a deal. Yet, the very fact that Carney felt compelled to make clarifying statements about his intentions underscores the political pressure he faced after Trump's tariff threats.
So now President Trump over the weekend threatening massive tariffs on Canada. The president posting this: if Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the USA. Now, the Canadian Prime Minister Carney now pushing back, saying this on Sunday: we have no intention of doing that with China or any other non-market economy. What we have done with China is to rectify some issues that developed in the last couple of years. So where does this stand?
The perception that Canada was veering toward Beijing, even if limited to tariff adjustment, was enough to trigger serious political blowback. From a nationalist standpoint, Trump's tariff threat constitutes effective use of economic leverage to discipline an ally whose policy choices could undermine shared market protections. Tariffs are not merely punitive tools. They are bargaining chips in international economic diplomacy. Trump's willingness to threaten a 100% tariff on Canadian imports is a drastic measure that signals both allies and adversaries that the US will not tolerate actions that compromise its economic interests. In a world where China uses trade agreements and investments as instruments of strategic influence, the United States cannot afford to allow its neighbors to function as Pacific bridgeheads for Chinese goods. Even Carney's walk back, insisting there is no intention of free trade pact with China, reflects the reality that Canada cannot afford to be isolated from its largest trading partner. The economic consequences of US tariffs could be severe for Canada, and Carney's public retreat illustrates that Canada understands this reality at a visceral level. Critics may frame Trump's approach as protectionist chest-beating, but the geopolitical context matters. China's rise as a strategic economic and military competitor to the US has reshaped global alignment. Allowing Chinese goods increased access through a close US ally would weaken the economic bloc that stands as a counterweight to Beijing's influence across Eurasia and Africa. This is not abstract geopolitics, it is strategic realism. Carney's Davos call for middle powers to band together against coercion may sound noble, but it ignores the fact that effective resistance to Chinese influence requires economic cohesion, not fragmentation of market alliances. Some analysts argue that Carney's actions were driven as much by domestic and global optics as by economic strategy, a desire to signal Canadian autonomy in virtue to progressive and globalist constituencies. By crafting a trade deal with Beijing and then championing multilateral coalition building at Davos, Carney may have sought to position Canada as an independent actor on the world stage. But such signaling is costly when it alienates your most critical ally. Critically, if Carney's leadership rationale was to position Canada as a global mediator or balancing force, it collapsed under economic and treaty realities when faced with Trump's readiness to apply tariff pressure. President Trump's forceful rejection of Carney's China outreach does more than defend US economic interests. It consolidates support among nationalist and America-first constituencies at home. Trump's rhetoric framing Canada's actions as undermining North American economic security resonates with voters who prioritize domestic industry protection, border sovereignty, and economic independence from authoritarian rivals. The bold threat of tariffs reinforced Trump's image as a leader unafraid to challenge allies who stray from aligned trade strategies and defend US workers and producers against unfair competition. The standoff highlights an essential question about North American unity under the USMCA. Can Canada assert economic autonomy when its prosperity is so intimately tied to access to the US market? The answer in this case appears to be no, or at least not without significant diplomatic cost. Trump's tariff threats are a tough but realistic reminder that economic alliances require coordination, not divergence, especially in a competitive global environment where China seeks every foothold it can find. Canadian leaders who ignore this interdependence risk not only economic harm, but diplomatic isolation. McCartney's pivot and public clarification that Canada never intended a full China Free Trade Agreement reveals the weakness in his earlier approach, whether driven by misplaced optimism about diversification or by a desire to make a geopolitical statement. The initial embrace of tariff cuts with China was a misstep that underestimated the economic and political leverage the United States holds over Canada. President Trump's assertive defense of U.S. economic interests, even to the point of threatening sweeping tariffs on a key ally, was not only justified but necessary. Canada's walk back, reaffirmation of commitments to USMCA constraints, and retreat from expansive China trade signals are evidence that Trump's position exposed how much Canada depends on the United States economically and strategically. In a world where economic competition with China continues to intensify, Trump's nationalist trade strategy stands not as a relic of protectionism, but as a strategic imperative to preserve North American economic cohesion and resist foreign encroachment into the heart of U.S. trade networks. As Canada learned this lesson, if the initial deal and subsequent retreat are any indication, it has, and it will echo in future negotiations.